So yeah, political right and equality, rolling back egalitarian modernity. So I think you're pulling together a lot of stuff that you've kind of been reading and thinking about and writing about for a bunch of different outlets for a long time here in terms of your sort of overall kind of view of the right, of the conservative intellectual tradition. So I mean, get us get us started here with what you're doing in this book.
Sure. Well, like the 30-second elevator pitch for the book is that it's a critical intellectual history of the right that's focusing on its most esteemed and auspicious figures. So, there's the odd dig at Jordan Peterson and Ben Shapiro in it because just couldn't resist. But for the most part, everyone in it is working at, let's call it a higher caliber of conservative and right-wing thinking. And the basic thesis of the book is that it's very hard to actually pin down what the political right is. And that's not just me saying that. Conservatives like Edmund Neal, for example, will say very hard to pin down what unites the right. And I came to the conclusion, drawing upon people like Corey Robin.
Unite the right is a phrase that hasn't aged well.
Yeah.
It's all awkward now because the associations, but yes, keep going.
Yeah, that's for sure, right? Everyone's favorite anti-Semites, that's what you think of when you think of Unite the Right. But long story short, I actually kind of cheekily point out that I think F.A. Hayek had the right idea about what the political right was committed to. And in his famous essay, Why I Am Not a Conservative, he points out that what makes one right or conservative is this conviction that there are demonstrably superior people in society, and that those demonstrably superior people or recognizably superior people are entitled to more status, more wealth, more power, more political influence, you name it, right? Now, who counts as a recognizably superior person? That really varies a great deal depending upon the right-wing thinker that you're talking about and why they are recognizably superior. That's also highly varied. But this is, from my perspective, what unites all the different streams of right-wing thinking together.
Yeah. So I want to dig into that. In some ways, this is like the setup to one of Plato's dialogues. It's like, oh, you know what a conservative is, right, Socrates? Then he points out that whatever definition Alcibiades or whoever comes up with, doesn't apply to all conservatives. But what if the anarcho-capitalists, Alcibiades? Oh, quite so, Socrates. This doesn't apply to them, right? So what's the what's the sort of what's the unifying thread? I mean, you say it's like about I've been kind of thinking about like the sort of thing that wraps together most of what we're talking about in the show tonight as being about equality, right? And that's in the that's in the title of it's in the title of your book. That that this is, I mean, there's certain kind, even if they think that in some sense some people are superior people, right? That's the von Mises, right? The letter to Ayn Rand, right? That I want to congratulate you.
You have the courage to tell the masses what no one else will tell them. You are inferior, and all the improvement in your conditions you owe to the efforts of men who are better than you.
Yeah, awesome.
Charming guy, right?
Fun people. Von Mises and Rand. Really want to spend time with them. But yeah, so I want to. I guess one way to do this, right, in the kind of time that we have, tonight is to sort of think about like some of the range of figures that you're talking about in this book, since, as you say, you're not sort of doing the, you're not just dunking on, Ben Shapiro and Jordan Peterson like some tawdry podcaster, I mean, this is, you're really engaging with the wine track, right intellectuals here.
Yeah. Irony being that their faces are on the book cover. Thank you very much, Andrew. By the way, I love the cover. But
please do judge this book by the cover.
Yeah, do. If you judge the book by the cover, then it'll be a much better product. That's for sure. It's the best thing in it.
Yeah. So tell me about some of these people. I mean, like who's the let's go through some of the rogues gallery of who you're covering in this book.
Sure. Well, the first person that I talk about is Aristotle. Not because Aristotle himself is particularly conservative or needs to be interpreted as conservative, but rather because something like the Aristotelian worldview, as I call it, has been hugely influential as an object of nostalgia for pretty much everybody on the political right, at least up until the middle of the 19th century. And what's characteristic of what I call the Aristotelian worldview, which Aristotle himself may or may not have bought into, is this notion that society is basically a pyramid organized along lines of what Charles Taylor calls hierarchical complementarity. So the idea being that people are by nature fundamentally unequal in terms of their capacities, unequal in their virtues, and unequal in what they're entitled to. Now, this doesn't mean that the people who are at the bottom of the pyramid aren't necessary to preserve the pyramid, right? You still need a slave class or a class of natural slaves in order to build things like the pyramids that the recognizably superior or the better people direct them to build. But just because everybody within the pyramid needs one another doesn't mean that they're entitled to the same level of dignity, the same level of treatment, let alone the same level of political influence. And the argument in the book is that this worldview was, for the most part, taken for granted all the way up until, depending on when you want to demarcate it, around the 15th and the 16th century, when, because of a confluence of different influences, Stoicism, certain kinds of Christianity, the advent of liberalism and Protestantism, what became a lot more central in many people's minds was this idea that actually, no, people are morally equal in a state of nature from the very beginning, or they're morally equal before the throne of God. There are a lot of different iterations of this. And you can see this in the writing of people like, say, Thomas Hobbes, right? Where actually Hobbes chastises a lot of his opponents who are arguing for a more conventional defense of monarchy by saying, look, in the state of nature, everybody is absolutely equal in terms of their moral status. They're pretty much equal in terms of their physical aptitudes. And in fact, he says, you might not think that that's true mentally, but in fact, I'm going to insist that people are even more equal in terms of their mental aptitudes than they are in any other kind of respect. And the same is true of Locke with his argument that people are morally equal within the state of nature, are entitled to certain kind of natural rights on that basis, yada, yada. This is skimming through things really quickly. But then in the 18th century, this became less of a theoretical issue, and it became much more of a political one, since people started taking these notions of moral equality very, very seriously and instituting revolutionary kinds of programs on that basis. Whether you think about the English Revolution or the English Civil War, or the American Revolution, the French Revolution, or most prominently the Haitian Revolution, which I think was the most consistent of all these kind of revolutionary epochs. And what occurred with this transition was the realization on a lot of people's part that you can no longer take this idea that people are fundamentally unequal and the model of social hierarchical complementarity for granted any longer. That people were really resistant to it. And in fact, the status quo perspective was starting to move in the opposite direction. Now the default position was we regard people as equal and you have to prove to us that they are unequal in some kinds of way. And pretty much every conservative figure or right-wing figure that I talk about in the book tries to make this case in certain kinds of important ways, albeit they're all very different from one another in important respects.
Yeah. So I guess like maybe the last thing to just in terms of this segment of our discussion tonight to get into again just to whet people's appetite before they go forth and do their homework. Which is definitely how I want people to think about the experience of watching this is it's like somebody forcing you to do homework. But in any case, is you've been talking about kind of the origins of a lot of conservative thought, and some of the like lines of historical development, right? But I am but you also do get into in this book sort of more contemporary developments.
Oh, yeah.
Among these people. And one that I was wondering if you could just speak to just for a couple minutes is the sort of the resurgence within kind of Weintrack intellectual conservatism of this like really unabashed illiberalism that in other words, like I don't know, like, von Mises and, and Ayn Rand, might have been, exchanging private letters about how most people are scum. But there's a sort of sense in which there's a lot of the, the right hasn't wanted to come out and be totally counter-revolutionary about at least the sort of basic ideals of the revolutions of the late 18th century. That there's a sort of, even like, there's a lot of, I don't know if you even think about a lot of kind of 20th century National Review-y kind of conservatism, right? There's like a lot of postulative conservatism as even the sort of, representing a kind of defense of individual rights and things like this. And so it is like one of the more interesting things about some of these people that you're talking about, that, increasingly you just get people who are like, no, I don't think people have rights. What are you talking about?
Yeah, that's for sure. Well, this is a fascinating question, and it's pretty much what I dedicate a whole chapter of the book to. So I'm only going to be able to give you a kind of snapshot of the main things here, but I think I'll say two things, right? One is that, as every good leftist knows, from Locke onwards, right, despite all the talk about equality within the state of nature, a certain kind of economic liberalism has very, very much played a role in ideologically supporting and abetting the instantiation of all kinds of exploitative capitalist hierarchies, right? That's just a historical fact. But what's interesting in the 20th century is just how ideologically rigorous this became, and how much it came to ape a lot of the rhetoric of conservatism. Actually, Sam Moyn wrote a really good book about this when he talked about Cold War liberalism. But let's just go with the Ludwig von Mises example, or an Ayn Rand example, because that's what we're on. One of the things that's characteristic of their work is Ayn Rand and Ludwig von Mises aren't nostalgic for the past. They make it very clear that the old kind of aristocratic European order that so many conservatives pine for was inefficient, boring, but most importantly, in that kind of context, it was pretty clear that the recognizably superior people weren't actually able to obtain the kind of status and affluence and power that was their due. Why? Because many people just inherited wealth, status, and power without having to do anything to earn it, right? And what you see with people like von Mises and Ayn Rand is the development of this ideology that actually capitalism, as a kind of competitive social Darwinian sorting mechanism, is the ideal kind of mechanism through which to allow the recognizably superior people to demonstrate that they are recognizably superior and to assume their proper role within society, right? And I think one of the ways to demarcate somebody who is kind of conservative in liberal clothing from somebody who might just be a right-wing liberal like Hayek is this belief that the primary focus of the market, or one of the primary virtues of the market, is allowing the kind of cream to rise to the top. And you also saw that even in the PragerU video that we were talking about, right? This idea that, well, in a capitalist society, the productive people will be sorted from the unproductive, and they'll get everything that they're entitled to, whereas the people who are intended to clean the sewers, well, that's what they'll end up doing, right? Now, in terms of the history of how this connects with the kind of broader right, which is my second point. There's a lot of good stuff that's been written about this, but the short answer is that around the 1950s, many on the political right, pretty justifiably in the United States, saw themselves as being on the back foot, right? It was right in the middle of the New Deal era. A kind of center liberalism was, broadly speaking, hegemonic, the kind of liberalism of FDR, Johnson, even Eisenhower, Kennedy, right? And at the same time, they saw that the civil rights movement was gaining a lot of steam, and it didn't look like anybody was being able to stop that train. And so what you see people like Bill Buckley, for example, doing, or Frank Meyer very successfully, is to try to form a coalition of groups that are opposed to more or less all of these developments, albeit for very different reasons. So they'll reach out to people who are kind of right-wing liberals or social Darwinians and say, look, you're opposed to New Deal liberalism, so you belong in our coalition. And then they'll reach out to social conservatives, particularly in the American South, and say, they're concerned with overreaching government in the economy. You're also concerned with overreaching government, but in this case, because they're trying to interfere with states' rights. no points for figuring out states' rights to do what's right. So you belong in our coalition also. And so this language of being hostile to government forms what Matthew Continenti calls a kind of joint where you can align these different groups together, even if they're motivated by very different resentments about what they perceive this kind of broadly liberal government as doing. And the kind of trial run for this new conservative fusion is 1964 with the Goldwater-Johnson campaign. And as everyone knows, Goldwater just crashed and burned, in no small part because he tried to campaign as radical, right? Saying that, kind of extremism in defense of liberty, as he understood it at least, is no vice. And the American people weren't going to have it. But what you start to see by the time you get to Nixon with this language of the moral majority is conservatives being able to code their new coalition as the kind of common sense or hegemonic view of the so-called average American citizen. And that's where I would argue the American right, as we now understand it, was really birthed in a modern context. Because from this idea of a kind of Nixonite silent majority or moral majority, you start to see Reaganism, Gingrichiism, definitely people like Rush Limbaugh, ultimately all the way leading to Trumpist populism emerge.
You have been watching free public content from Give Them an Argument. To access every single episode of the show, the main show on Monday nights, all of the streams, all of the debate breakdowns, all of the patron-exclusive post-games on Monday nights, all of the patron-exclusive bonus episodes every week, and much, much more, go to patreon.com/Ben Burgis. I cannot resist ending this with, don't be foolish.